The Keitel consensus shuddered through their equivalent of a neural link. The signal, impossibly faint, had been flagged by the long-range passive monitors on the fringe of the Sagittarius arm. It wasn't a structured transmission, no neat packets of data or modulated waveforms. It was a raw, unfiltered bleed of biological stress, a psychic scream so potent it had crossed light years of vacuum. To the Keitel, and a species whose entire civilization was built upon the empathic network they called the sensus, it was like hearing a single terrified heart beating in the absolute silence of a tomb. Lead harmonizer. 7, whose role was to interpret and manage these emotional intrusions, pulsed a wave of concerned query through the sensus. The signal was chaotic, a mess of pain, isolation, and a deep primal terror unlike anything in their collective memory. It was also remarkably singular. Most species, and when they ventured into the black, did so in groups, their shared consciousness creating a kind of emotional white noise. This one was utterly alone. Origin point, 7 pulsed to the navigators. Translate it. We must go to it. The distress is absolute. The navigators, a caste whose minds were attuned to the subtle gravimetric eddies of space, traced the signal back to its source, a small primitive vessel drifting in the outer orbit of an unremarkable yellow star. Thus a system so far from the major trade routes, it might as well have been in another universe. The life form broadcasting this agony was the sole occupant. It took them 3 of their cycles to make the journey, a period during which the sensus was perpetually tinged with the distant suffering. The harmonizers worked to filter it, to prevent the despair from seeding discord within their own peaceful collective, but it was a constant, draining effort. When they finally arrived, and the source of the signal was worse than they had imagined, the human vessel, if one could call it that, was a wreck. It was a small, functional craft, its hull punctured in several places, the wounds hastily and poorly sealed with what looked like solidifying foam. One of its main engine nacelles was a blackened, twisted scar, evidence of a catastrophic malfunction. It tumbled slowly, power flickering from its few remaining running lights like a dying firefly. It was a tomb, and yet, the life sign, the beacon of torment, still flickered within. Lead medical harmonizer Calixix took point. They were the closest thing the Keitel had to a surgeon, though their tools were not scalpels and lasers, but emotional resonance and the deep calming hum of the sensus. They extended a tendril of pure empathic calm towards the vessel, a gentle probe into the maelstrom within. The response was immediate and violent. A wave of startlement, a spike of pure, undiluted fear, and then a desperate, clawing hope. It was like a drowning creature breaking the surface for a single, gasping breath. "He is aware of us," Calixix pulsed. "His emotional state is volatile, a rapid oscillation between despair and a fierce, almost painful will to live." "Can you stabilize him?" 7 asked. "The proximity is making the signal overwhelming." "I can try, but I must understand the source of the trauma first. I must see through his emotional memory." Calixix closed their sensory organs, focusing the entire weight of their consciousness on the singular point of the human. They didn't see in images or hear in sounds. They experienced. They were plunged into the human's recent past, a cascade of pure feeling. First, there was the immense, soul-lifting thrill of achievement, the launch, the raw physical power of it, a joy so profound it was almost painful. Then, a subtle shift, a quiet, a steady hum of satisfaction. The beauty of the void outside his viewport, a sight that filled him with a quiet, reverent awe. This was a creature that felt deeply. Then, the terror, a shudder, a violent jarring, a soundless explosion that he felt through the deck plates. The emotional state plummeted from contentment to raw, heart-stopping shock, confusion, a frantic scramble of diagnostics. Then a cold, creeping dread as he realized the damage was catastrophic. Power was failing, and life support was compromised. He was alone. Clixix experienced the crushing weight of isolation, a feeling so vast and heavy it was a physical presence in the human's mind. He sent out signals, desperate electronic cries for help, and was met with nothing but the hiss of the void. The silence was a torture. He talked to himself, to the recordings of his family he would watch on a small screen, his emotional state a tightrope walk between forced, brittle calm and a rising tide of panic. And then came the cold. The life support was dying. He felt it as a creeping numbness, a lethargy that was both a mercy and a threat. He knew that to sleep was to die. He fought it. He would slap his own face, his emotional state flaring with a sharp, bright pain to stave off the creeping darkness. Clixix felt each slap as a shock to their own system. He thought of his home, a blue and green world. He thought of another human, a female with soft eyes and a laugh that felt like warmth. And the love that radiated from this memory was so potent, so pure, it brought a moment of peace to the observer. But it was immediately followed by the gut-wrenching agony of loss. He would never see her again. He would die alone, frozen, his body tumbling in this metal coffin for eternity. The despair that followed was the source of the signal, a scream of pure, existential dread. Clixix recoiled, pulling back from the human's mind. The emotional torrent was exhausting. Oh, but they had their diagnosis. This was not a sickness of the body, though that would surely follow. This was a sickness of the soul, a malady of absolute isolation. The human was dying not from the cold or the lack of air, but from the terrible, crushing knowledge that he was utterly, completely alone in the universe. "We must go to him," Clixix pulsed to Seven. "Physically, now." "The risk is minimal," Seven agreed. "His vessel is primitive. We can dock." The Cattell ship, a smooth, the organic-looking construct of pearlescent gray, maneuvered alongside the human wreck. A soft, fleshy proboscis extended from its side and latched onto the human's airlock, forming a perfect, airtight seal. For a long moment, nothing happened. The human inside, a man named Captain Elias Vance, stared at the foreign object attached to his only door. He had felt their presence, a strange, calming pressure in his mind, but this was real. This was physical. His hope, which he had all but extinguished, flared back into a roaring, painful fire. With trembling hands, he cycled his airlock. The hiss of equalizing pressure was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. The inner door opened, and he was met not by a humanoid figure in a pressure suit, but by a wave of warm, humid air that smelled of damp earth and ozone. And then they stepped through. They were tall, bipedal, but with a grace that was inhuman. Their skin was a smooth gray-green, and they had large, liquid black eyes that held no malice, only a deep, profound concern. They wore no clothes, but their bodies were covered in a fine, almost imperceptible layer of downy fur. The lead one, Clixix, reached out a three-fingered hand, not to touch, but to gesture, a silent invitation. Elias just stared, his body racked with exhaustion and relief. He tried to speak, but his voice was a cracked whisper. You came." The words were meaningless to the Cattell, but the emotional signature behind them was not. They felt his overwhelming gratitude, his disbelief, his fragile, tentative joy. Clixix stepped forward and gently placed their hand on Elias's chest, over his heart. The contact was electric. For the first time since the accident, Elias felt a connection. He felt a wave of pure, unconditional acceptance wash over him, a silent assurance that he was no longer alone. He slumped against the bulkhead, tears streaming silently down his face. Orwas, and for the first time in weeks, he was not afraid. They brought him to their ship. The interior was a labyrinth of softly glowing organic passages, pulsing with a gentle rhythmic light. They led him to a chamber that was clearly a medical bay, though it bore no resemblance to anything human. There were no metal tables or glaring lights. Instead, there was a soft, warm depression in the floor, lined with a moss-like substance. Calixix guided him to lie down. As he rested, the Cattell worked. And they didn't use injections or pills. They clustered around him, their bodies radiating a gentle heat. They extended their empathic senses, not to probe, but to soothe. They felt the deep-seated knots of terror in his mind and began to gently, painstakingly untangle them. They projected feelings of safety, of warmth, of companionship. They shared with him the collective memory of their own world, the gentle hum of the census, the feeling of being part of a vast, interconnected whole. For Elias, and it was like being wrapped in a warm embrace after a lifetime in a blizzard. He slept, truly slept, for the first time since the accident. And as he slept, they monitored. They felt the echoes of his trauma, the phantom pains of his isolation, and in a move that was unprecedented in their history, they decided on a radical course of treatment. They didn't just want to heal him. They wanted him to know he was understood. When Elias woke, he felt different, lighter, that the crushing weight in his chest was gone. He looked up to see Calixix watching him, their large eyes filled with something akin to tenderness. Then it happened. Calixix gently touched his forehead, and Elias's mind was flooded with everything. He didn't see images, he felt them. He felt the terrifying jolt of the explosion from the Cetel's perspective. He felt their own confusion at the strange, powerful signal. He felt the long, arduous journey to reach him, the persistent, a draining effort it took to carry his despair across the light years. He felt the moment they first touched his mind, the raw shock of his terror. And then he felt something else. He felt their fear. It was a quiet, subtle thing, buried deep beneath their professional calm. It was the fear of failing him, the fear that they would arrive too late, the fear that this strange, brave, lonely creature would slip away before they could offer him the one thing he needed most. And they had shared his distress. They had felt his pain as their own, and now they were sharing that burden back with him. They were showing him that his suffering was not isolated, that it had been witnessed, carried, and understood by minds from across the galaxy. They were showing him that in his most desperate moment, he had not been alone. Elias gasped, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just come to rescue him. They had come because they felt his pain and they couldn't bear it. His agony had become theirs. They had made his problem their own. He looked at the beings around him, these strange, gray-green aliens with their soft eyes and gentle touch, and he saw not just rescuers, but fellow beings who had shared in his ordeal. The tears that fell now were not of fear or relief, but of a profound, overwhelming connection. He reached out and took Calixix's hand, holding it tightly. "Thank you," he whispered, and this time the meaning was not just in the words, but in the feeling behind them. A wave of pure, heartfelt gratitude, so powerful it made the Cattell collectively tremble. In the census, a new thread was woven. It was not a thread of Cattell emotion, but a human one, a thread of profound gratitude and connection, permanently linking the memory of this lone human to the entire collective consciousness of an alien race. They had come as medics to treat a distress signal. They left as something more, forever bound to the human they had saved and to the powerful, unshakable truth that some pains are too great to be borne alone.